Yeah, so as Ron said, my name is Lindsay Syhakhom. I'm a solutions architect at Logicworks. Logicworks is a premier AWS consulting partner. We've been a premier partner for over 8 years at this point. And so we're really kind of the top tier of consulting partner, both for cloud migrations, for optimization projects, for managed services, basically anything you'd need an expert, cloud expert for, we can help you. So today I'm going to be talking about scaling your AWS footprint with multi-account architectures, which is a bit of a mouthful. It could have been also titled how to organize all the things you've got going on in AWS better, right? Kind of how to Marie Kondo your AWS footprint and how to make sure it can grow in a sustainable way. So in order to talk about this, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. So I am a solutions architect. That means I talk to customers every day about where they are in their cloud journey. And normally the customers I talk to are at some kind of a crossroads in their AWS adoption. So a little bit of story about this company that I talked to about a year ago now. They were a finance SaaS company. They came to us and they said, we need to get out of our data center in 9 months. We've got some applications in our office. We've got some applications in AWS. We've got some in a colo. We've got some in other cloud providers. And when I dug into what they were actually looking for, it's like, I know you want to migrate resources into AWS. What do you actually have in AWS today so we can integrate with that? They told us this story, which is that they have multiple teams operating on AWS semi-independently, and they have a lot of difficulty. Their central IT team, those are the people we were talking to, getting everyone on the same page in terms of what the standards were, how things should be organized. On top of that, to add more complexity into that equation, they had a lot of different regulatory control frameworks, and some of their environment was in scope for PCI and some of it wasn't. But because a lot of their AWS resources were together in the same environment, it was very difficult for them to have really any visibility into what was going on from an organization standpoint. So they had obviously some complexity going on there. What they asked us to do, what they asked me to do was, can you just build out a new VPC for us in our existing AWS account and start migrating some resources for us? And my answer to that was, yes, we can do that, but let's also zoom out so that we can look at what's going on in your AWS footprint and in your co-location facility and in your office data center. And let's lay a more solid foundation in AWS for you so that, so if we built out a VPC and migrated some resources, maybe we'd solve your problem, the immediate problem in front of you. But after we're done, you're still going to have the same problems that you're facing. Let's get on more solid footing. So what I did was, the first thing I did was look at what they're actually running in AWS today, right? And I'm going to walk you through this diagram. So this black boundary right here represents an AWS account. For those of you who are very new to AWS, an AWS account, I don't mean a user's account, like a user's credentials account. I mean an AWS account. So if you went to AWS today and you signed up and you got it to the console, all the resources that are within that account are what I'm referring to, right? It's kind of the logical container for the resources you put into AWS. They had a single account that contained everything. And how the boundary that they were using between resources and teams was the VPC. And I'm sure everybody knows what a VPC is at this point, a virtual private cloud. You can think of it as a site arranged in the cloud, right? Your network in the cloud. And they were basically doing one VPC per business unit. And so for their SaaS product, they had a single tenant SaaS product, which means, they had resources. Every one of their SaaS customers had their own set of dedicated AWS resources. They were putting all of those customers, all those single tenant customers in the same subnet, in the same virtual private cloud, in the same account. And what that meant, as you can see on the right-hand side of this screen, is that it was very difficult for them to limit blast radius. If somebody did something, it affected other people. They had a very complicated IAM permission structure, right? So IAM is identity and access management. They had great difficulty giving some of their developers access to some resources and not to others, right? Because things were very blurred. And importantly, people were stepping on each other in the environment and getting frustrated. So that's an important metric as well, right? And when I zoomed out, right, that was zooming in. Let's zoom out for a second. What I saw in the boundaries of their AWS account is that they had all these virtual private clouds, these VPCs, that had very complex connections to one another, networking connections and access connections to one another, very complicated nested relationships, right? And so they were asking us for two things. They said, we need boundaries. I apologize for that weird coming in on the slide there. We need boundaries, right? We need better security and resource boundaries. We need to limit what certain developers can and cannot do in certain resources. We'd love to say developers can only do such and such in development and other things in production, right? We need better boundaries and better limits. And just practically, they're a single tenant SaaS company, right? So they want to bill their customers for what those customers are using in AWS. So that if they had better billing segmentation from an AWS perspective, it would be much easier for them to charge back to their customers. So the customer came to us and said, we need boundaries, but we also need centralization. We also need centralized identity and access so that we're not having confusing IAM permissions, right? We need baseline security standards so that it's not the Wild West, right? We need centralized logging, right? We have a SEM. We need to funnel all logs into some kind of centralized S3 bucket so that we can push it to the SEM. We need centralized policy enforcement and drift detection. We need to know if something's going wrong in one of these environments. And even if we install a great tool like Trend Micro, for instance, an antivirus or anti-malware on a host, we want to know not only that there's detection of malware on the host, but we also want to enforce policies on what certain developers can and cannot install on that host, right? And we also want networking that doesn't suck. We don't want this nested architecture. We want a much more transparent and easy to manage networking setup. So the principle that we introduced was, rather than using the VPC as the core organizing principle or the core organizing boundary, you can think of it as in AWS, let's use the AWS account as the principal boundary. And if you've paid attention to the AWS sort of architecture space for the past couple of years, this has really been the direction the whole industry is moving towards, right? Rather than having that VPC as the boundary, having the account as the boundary. That is the current state of best practice. Why multiple accounts? Because you have isolation by SDLC tier, right? So what I talked about, having dev and prod in separate AWS accounts, not just separate VPCs, provides a stronger boundary between those resources. Administrative isolation between workloads. So product 1 and product 2 should be in different accounts, right? Also minimizing blast radius, we talked about that, and strong isolation for auditing data. So this company, they have some PCI data and some non-PCI data. Wouldn't it be nice if we could reduce their audit scope by organizing things a little bit better so that the audit only looked at the parts of their environment it actually needed to look at? So what did we set up? We said, okay, for this SaaS application, you've got this single tenant SaaS application. Let's set up a prod account, a stage account, and a dev account for customer 1. And for your other products, let's also set up prod, stage, and dev accounts for all of these separate products. So basically, we've gone from 1 account to 12 accounts, right? And you may be wondering to yourself, wow, we're adding a lot of complexity here, right? At the same time as we're putting things where they belong, we're also adding complexity. So how do we organize this complexity? And the answer is this thing called AWS organizations, right? Which is just a sort of very simple organizational structure for your AWS accounts that lets you have what's sometimes called a root account or a centralized management account, used to be called a master account, that sort of orchestrates and organizes these sub-accounts and lets you actually organize your accounts into what's called an OU and have that under the management account. And that management account allows you to centralize a bunch of stuff while also having these discrete accounts separated into where they need to be. So let's talk about governing this structure, right? Because now that we've got all these accounts, how do we govern this? That's the first question this company asked us, is that great if everybody's working in their own camps, great if they have autonomy within the account, but we have some kind of account level control. But how do we govern this? What do we do with logs? Where do our bills go? How do admins traverse accounts if they need to get across accounts? And how do we not have still have that tangled networking web, right? If we also need to traverse account boundaries, how do we get out of and into the next account adjacent to us if we need to, right? And most importantly, this question bolded at the bottom, how do we automate setting up these accounts so that they're not all snowflakes, right? We're trying to set them up with a foundation that scales more easily, not set them up with a one-time good foundation. And the answer to that question is something called AWS Control Tower, which is you can think of it as AWS's opinionated architecture and tool set for multi-account governance best practices. So it gives you a lot of the things I just talked about out of the box. You basically set up that root or management account, you deploy Control Tower into it, and it sets up a lot of default principles, practices, accounts, baselines, monitoring, logging. It sets up a lot of that for you in a way that matches the current best thinking about AWS that AWS architects are putting forward. Logicworks actually was involved in the creation of AWS Control Tower in that we influenced the design, and we think personally that it's the best available sort of standardized architecture on the market for AWS. It is not a service that costs something, right? AWS Control Tower is not a PaaS service that costs something. It is just, you can think of it as an opinionated architecture and set of CloudFormation templates that deploy a architecture that is considered to be best practice. The other really cool thing that AWS Control Tower has is it allows for expansion over time via something called Account Factory. So that piece that I highlighted at the end, right? How do we set up more accounts that have these guardrails already built in? That's Account Factory. So if you guys are interested, if you are more of the AWS expert audience, what is Control Tower? Again, it sets up AWS SSO. It sets up a log archive with CloudTrail and AWS config. It allows user account provisioning through service catalog. It makes it much easier to do centralized routing with AWS Transit Gateway, which I can get into in a minute. So all of these elements that you've probably heard about are best practices at AWS. It kind of builds those in. And there's also a dashboard for Control Tower, right? That allows you to see what resources have been deployed. I want to talk about this account factory piece because I think it's so important, especially if you're a SaaS company like the company we're talking about today. This finance SaaS company, every time they wanted to onboard a new customer, they had to build out manually resources within a VPC that already existed. So they really wanted to get away from that system, right? Because it's time consuming. It took them 2 to 3 months. It didn't really make any sense. So what we did was we said, if every customer is going to have their own account, then we can automate the build out of every account. And we can even bake into the templates your SaaS code into the template so that every time we press go on Account Factory and it spits out a new account for a new customer, it also launches the resources within the VPC that are already pre-baked with your application. So we went from, having a highly manual system to, because there's such a clear boundary between customers, we're able to automate that process kind of soup to nuts. I also wanted to highlight what I think is probably the coolest feature of Control Tower, sort of an ancillary feature of Control Tower, which is AWS Transit Gateway. I highly encourage you guys to look up AWS Transit Gateway after this presentation is done, because it's probably my favorite AWS service. It allows you, it's kind of a super router that allows you to connect multiple accounts, your on-premise data center, multiple virtual private clouds, inbound VPN connections. And the best practice today is to put that transit gateway, or a transit gateway per region, in a networking account, in its own discrete account, that then has connections throughout the whole control tower. So throughout your whole AWS organization is this kind of central router. And you have multiple route tables, obviously, in the transit gateway that's governing what connection is allowed to go where. And this is very powerful to centralize these connections, obviously. And you can do a lot of cool logging and analysis with this transit gateway. So I highly recommend you guys look into that system. And this is the sort of less glamorous part of Control Tower, but it's nonetheless cool, which is that every AWS account you have a much easier time understanding what AWS costs you when your boundary is the account versus your boundary is the VPC. So you can actually see, here's what AWS account 1 and AWS account 2 and everything cost me. So your central IT team is going to be much happier being able to sort of both charge back to end customers and tell the business what parts of the AWS environment are really costing them. So to summarize, this was what we built for this finance SaaS company. We did an assessment of each team's unique requirements. We did an assessment of their central IT governance practices. We built them an architecture design that was based on the multi-account control tower framework. Then we built out the control tower for them. We set up SSO, we set up centralized logging, we set up transit gateway, we set up config. And the cool part about control tower now is that you can, if you've already got some AWS stuff, this doesn't mean you have to throw that all away and start again. You can actually set up this sort of scaffolding that is control tower and absorb any existing AWS accounts you already have into this structure. So it's like organizing messy files that are on the floor. You can absorb those existing files into this structure. The last thing we did, obviously, we automated future account build out with guardrails built in. And what that meant for them was that SaaS customer onboarding went from 2 to 3 months to a week or less. I think we're now down to like 3 days. They've got a much more mature security posture in terms of segregation between resources. And that governance that I've talked about is through automation, not sort of somebody manually checking their AWS logs, right? We were also able to reduce their audit scope by having better boundaries between the PCI and the non-PCI data. They had less conflict and firefighting between teams and clearer chargeback to their end customers. So to summarize, while they came to us for this sort of discrete project of, please help us migrate to AWS quickly, we were able to do that while also in parallel helping them get better organized in terms of their AWS footprint so that they could scale faster in the future. So that when they came to us for future customer build outs, it took, a couple of weeks versus a long project. So that's it for us. Again, my name's Lindsay. Logicworks is a strategic consultant. We do cloud migration and managed services. If you're interested in AWS Control Tower, if you're interested in any of the things I talked about today, I encourage you to reach out to us. That's our web address, logicworks.com, or call us. And thanks.